Hello everyone, and welcome back to the next part in our series on how to build an auth service from scratch. In the previous video we set up Auth0 as our authentication provider and passed most of the endpoint tests. We didn't write any code to do that so far, so it's time to catch up. In this video we will be adding authentication code to our FastAPI project and implementing the user/info endpoint that will require the user's access token. Before that, however, I want to do some cleanup and start breaking things out into separate files in our project. I'll create an auth.py file where I will have all of the information, all of the code related to authentication. I also want to have a config.py file where we'll read the environment variables, and I will create the .env file itself. I want to move the IFT service key to the env file. And then my config.py file, I will import base settings from Pydantic, which we will use to define a class for the settings. And for now, we want to just read the IFT service key from the .env file. So, for example, for now in the main.py file, I want to import the settings we've just defined, where we have a function to compare the service key header value. We instead replace it with the IFT service key from the settings in the config.py file. So I want to save it now and give it a test run. I need to launch the UVcorn server. And I think I made a mistake here. And now fire up ngrok. I want my URL. Updated the IFT service with the new URL. And give the endpoint tests a quick run. Okay, looks good here. The status endpoint is still passing both of the tests, so it can pick up the IFT service key we've moved to the .env file. I wanted to check this because we'll be using it a lot for storing all of the client IDs and other authentication related stuff later on in this video. Now I want to move my check service key function and the auth exception to the auth.py file and start accumulating all of the authentication related code there. So I moved the check service key function to the auth.py file, and now I'm importing those two from it. Let's give the endpoint tests one more run, and we're still green here. So I think we're good for now. And let's jump into the Auth0 details. There's a good tutorial in the Auth0 blog on how to build a FastAPI server with Auth0. I welcome you to go through it in more detail because it explains how exactly the code to verify a token is going to work. I'm not going to go into all of that detail, and instead I'm going to go to their GitHub repo for the example code mentioned in this blog post. And that's kind of my idea. I want to take a ready solution off the shelf and not worry too much about what's happening behind the scenes right now. I'm going to need the verify token class almost in its entirety, right until the return statement here. Put this in my auth.py file. I'm not going to check the permissions or the scopes, so I will remove these two checks. And now I just need to fix a few dependencies. Now that I have JWT, I'm going to remove this stuff that I don't need right now, and also the configuration. We'll be accessing it directly from our settings object. And let's see what are the config values that we're missing. So we need algorithms, API audience, and issuer. And also we need the domain. I'll need to get those in my .env file. To get these values, let's go back to our auth0 application. And we have the domain right here. The issuer is the same as the domain, just with the protocol in front of it. The algorithm is going to be RS-256. And now the API audience. This is where we can refer back to the auth0 blog on how to hook these up together. It says that we need to, before we can use this code, we need to have an API created for our app in auth0. So not to go into too much detail what this means, we have an application set up, and this is our to-do demo, but we also need to create an API for our application. Now that we have it created, the identifier that we used here is the value that we'll need to use as the audience parameter and authorization call. So this is what we need to put into the .env file. And now back to our config file. I will add these so that we can read the values from the environment variables. And finally, in the auth.py file, we can replace these placeholders with the values we get from the config.py file. And when we save it and run the server, nothing will really change, but let's see if we get any errors. Okay, the application started. We didn't miss anything this time, but we don't have anything that uses the verify token code. So what we want to do right now is create a method that will use the verify token class and call the verify method with the token. And it would either return an error if the token could not be validated, or it is not valid, or it will decode the token and return the user ID that was sent in that token. We have no other way of learning the user ID. Well, we could call auth0 specifically to ask for it, but it's not necessary because it is already encoded in the token. So what we'll be doing is we'll be extracting the user ID from the token and then passing it as a dependency to all of our authenticated API endpoints like we do with the service key right now. So that each point when called with the token would already get a user ID through the token validation flow. In the tutorial on the auth0 blog here, what they are suggesting for simplicity is to check the token in the route itself. So they're getting a token through a dependency that checks if there is a bearer token in the header, and if there is one, extracts it. If there is not one, there will be an error raised, and then passes this token to the verify token method. And if the result has a status, that means there is an error. It will return the bad request and return the result, or it would just return the result without the 400 error code. We'll be using very similar logic, but since we want to protect multiple routes, we would rather use the check token function as a dependency on all of our routes rather than doing it this way in every single route. The code for this would look like this. We have the check access token function. It depends on the token scheme, which we'll need to provide first. So from FastAPI security, import HTTP bearer. And then we can say that our token auth scheme is HTTP bearer. And we also depends here. And I think that should do it. So anytime we call the check access token function, the entire request is passed in by FastAPI, and a token is extracted if there is one that matches the HTTP bearer token auth scheme. And then the result is a verify token call with the credentials from the token we extracted. If there is a status in the result, we raise the auth exception, which we've defined for the service key. It will work the same way here. And if there isn't one, then the user ID is part of the sub-attribute of the result, and we'll be returning the user ID. I think just for debugging right now, I'm going to add a print statement that I will remove later. One more thing we need to implement before we can chain it all together and run the authentication test start to finish is the user information retrieval endpoint. If we look at the docs for what is expected in the /user/info endpoint response, we see the request needs to be authenticated with a bearer token in the header, and the response needs to contain the name, the ID as strings, and an optional URL. So this is the JSON format that we need to respond with. The problem for us right now is that our API does not know anything about the user, like the name or the ID. Auth0 holds that information for us because we delegated the user management aspect of the entire operation to it. Fortunately, Auth0 has an endpoint we can use. If we look at the API docs for the Authentication API section, and under the user profile, we got the getUserInfo method. The path to it is our Auth0 API domain /userinfo. And we need to send the access token. In response, we get the information such as the ID, that is the sub-attribute here. This stands for the user ID in Auth0, and a bunch of other things that we will not be using at this time. I'm going to add the code I prepared in advance that will put together an HTTP request to the Auth0 domain, called the userinfo endpoint, have the token added to the header as a bearer token, and get the response from the endpoint, parse the JSON, and then return the user variable. I'm going to save the endpoint. This is calling as an environment variable just in case it changes in the future or I need to change it in the future. So the response from this endpoint will contain the name key, which will be the username we'll save in IFT, and the sub key will be the ID. And the URL is just the hard-coded URL because I don't want to set this up for now for my user. So this is a pydantic model that I will set up here in a moment. I'm going to create a separate file for this called schemas.py. I will create two classes here. These are the schemas that FastAPI will use to either validate what we are sending or what we are getting back. I have two classes here, one with just the ID as a string, and the other one that extends it with the name and the URL. We will later be using the base user class when we need just the user ID at each endpoint to call the database, for example. After saving it, we need to import this. And it looks like we don't have any more warnings from Visual Studio Code in this file. With this in place, we will add the route. For now, we're doing that in the main.py file. Later on, we will break this out into different files for each type of the route and use FastAPI router to put them all together in our main application. Let's use this route as a template. Instead of checking the service key, we want to import our check access token function. And we need another dependency in the function itself. So this dependency will call the get user information, validate the response against the schema, and put it all into the user variable. And we can return a data object, which is our user. We don't need to worry too much about what happens behind the scenes when the tokens are passed around. But to recap briefly, the first dependency will check that there is a bearer token in the header and validate it. If it's not valid, an error will be returned. And then the second dependency will call the user info endpoint from auth0 and fetch the user information, make sure it complies with the schema we built for it, and then put it into the user variable to make it available to us inside the function. I'm going to save it and have the server reload. Still have ngrok running, connected to IFT. We want to keep running authentication tests. Our goal is to have them all green, and so far we had the user information endpoint red. And we still have a red dot here. Let's see what we have. We have an unauthorized error. I believe that's coming directly from auth0. Or actually, no, this is our auth exception. And in the server log, we have a print statement from the check access token function. So the status is error, and that's why the 400 was raised, the auth exception, and the message invalid payload padding. I think to help us debug this further, I want to print the token and run the test one more time. So here we have our bearer token. let's put it in jwt.io to decode it. Looks like there's still no payload. To fix this, I need to pass my API audience to auth0 so that it knows my app and that it can access the API. In the authorization URL, I'm going to add the API audience. I made a small mistake here. The parameter should be just audience, not API audience. Sorry about that. Let's see what the tests show this time. And this time we have invalid issuer. I think that's one other thing that I can fix quickly. So invalid issuer, it is comparing with what we have in the environment variable. And I believe there's a trailing slash that's required here. I need to restart the server so it picks up the updated .env file. And this is why I like the authentication and endpoint tests suite. They can allow us to fix one thing at a time. Right now you can see that the user information endpoint is actually green. We have the ID, username, which is the email, and the URL I hard-coded. So this means that our token is being validated, and auth0 is also accepting it at the user info endpoint that auth0 provides. That's good. Now the access token, everything related to refresh and access tokens are red now. And again, we're missing the refresh token in the response. I think I've seen a setting for that. In our API application, let's see if we can find something related to refresh tokens or offline access. And there we go. Allow offline access. And if we save it, and one other thing that I needed to tweak while I was trying to make it work is the permissions under machine-to-machine applications. So I had to authorize my IFTTT app service application to allow the API to access it. One more test run. And we've reached a huge milestone. Look at that, all of the tests are now green. The user information endpoint is working. We have the data returned as expected. Let's have the token and decode it one more time. Okay, so now this payload section and the token, we can see all the information that's encoded in it. This is the issuer that I had to fix, and this is the user ID, which allows us to grab the user ID from the token itself without having to call auth0. And we have the audiences and the scopes listed here as well. But the only thing we're using from here really is the user ID, because it is universal for my user in auth0. It is shared between our main to-do application, its backend. It is used in the database to record which user the ID belongs to, the to-do belongs to. And this is very important to us because it allows us to store the user ID at IFT and display it to the user. I'll show that a bit later. I want to do a little bit of cleanup before we wrap it up for this session. I no longer need the print statements here. Seems like we have it all figured out in the auth.py file. So I created the routes folder in the service.py file where I want to store the routes related to the service, like the status endpoint or the user information endpoint. And later I can have actions.py where we'll store routes for our action. So from the main.py file, I'm going to grab these two. And this should be router from FastAPI. I think that's everything we need. I actually don't need the settings. And now in the main.py file, we need to include our routers. So I can do away with this import, these imports, and I'm going to remove the hello world route. And our application still starts, so that's good. And that looks so much cleaner now in our main.py file and in our service.py file. Let's run through the tests one last time. All good here. And now over to endpoint tests. Okay, the status is still good. And the user information endpoint is red. The reason this is red is because of how the test setup flow works. We'll cover that in the next section before we tackle our first action. But our biggest achievement today is the fact that all of the authentication tests are passing, and we won't have to concern ourselves with our code in the auth.py file again as we build triggers, queries, and actions. And that's it for now. Congratulations on making it this far. We have a service with end-user authentication, and that's a huge achievement in any first-time service build on IFT. In the next video, we'll create our first action and test it in an applet end-to-end. Don't forget to subscribe to the IFT YouTube channel, and I'll see you soon.